In the last section, we finished up our discussion on state. Just the one last thing I want to mention about it is that we only use state with class-based components. So I've got a class-based component right here. This has access to state. Any functional components we create, like the header, does not have access to state. So whenever you want to use state, you got to be thinking class-based component. Okay, last thing I'm going to mention there about state. So at this point in time, believe it or not, we have probably covered about 85% of the entire React API, like all the different methods you can call. We've talked about props, state, lifecycle methods, functional components, class-based components. There's not a lot more to talk about regarding React. So React really has a famously tiny library, and it's certainly a subject that I would say is quick to learn but long to master. So as far as the React side of things go in this course, we are really going to build out our knowledge of all the topics we've covered so far and figure out how to combine them in more complex ways. But there's not really many more topics like really brand new API calls or systems or anything like that having to do with React that we're going to be discussing. So it's one of my favorite part of the libraries without a doubt. Anyways, we now have our list of albums. They are available as this.state.albums. That is what it is set to. That's how we're going to get access to that list. So it is now time for us to build a list of albums to show the user. We want to show a list of components. In particular, because we loaded up 5 different albums, we should now have 5 different album detail components. Remember, we said that the album detail component was going to be the component that would show just a single album. So in other words, what we need to do now is make a list. That's what we got to do. Let's pull up a diagram really quick that's going to help us understand how to build lists. So on the left-hand side is a representation of the albums array that we have. So this.state.albums. So each red box here represents one album. What we need to do is kind of transform each of these objects into a component. That's our goal. For each album that we have loaded up, we want to create one album detail component, which we're going to create very shortly here. That is the goal. To do this transformation, we're going to use the map method. We are going to map over our array of albums, and for each album we have loaded, we will return one album detail component. Okay, so that's the goal. Back over inside of my album list, I'm going to make a helper method to generate this list of album details, excuse me. So I'm going to add a method in here called render albums. Then I'm going to take my list of albums that we've now fetched, which is available as this.state.albums, and I'm going to map over it. If you're not familiar with the map function, no problem. Map is an array helper. I get to call it on this.state.albums because albums right here is an array. The way that map works is we pass in a fat arrow function. Then inside of the fat arrow function, or excuse me, let me rephrase that. Our fat arrow function will be called 5 times, one for each album that we've loaded. Whatever we return from that function will be entered into a new array that gets returned from the map function. I don't know. I can talk about this stuff for all day. Let's just put the code in, and I think it'll be a little bit more obvious what's going on. So I'll add in my fat arrow function. The fat arrow function will be called with a single album out of the albums array. And then for each album, I'm just going to return a text tag that contains the album's title. So album.title. Notice that because I am inside of some JSX here, and I want to make reference to a JavaScript variable, specifically album.title, I'm going to wrap it with curly braces. So remember, whenever we want to reference a JavaScript variable within JSX, we wrap it with curly braces. Otherwise, React just thinks we're trying to show some text. And finally, I'm going to make sure that I return this new array that I've now created. Let me get some more space here. There we go. Then the last step is I'm going to replace inside of my render method, I'm going to replace that text tag down here with a reference to this.renderAlbums. So again, I am making reference to a JavaScript variable or function within some JSX. So I'm going to replace or I'm going to place my curly braces and then call this .render albums. All right, so let's give this a shot now. I am going to flip over to simulator. Let's do our refresh. And hot dog, I've got a list of all my album names. Taylor Swift. I'm not, necessarily a Taylor Swift fan. I'm not going to say I'm a Taylor Swift fan, but she's a nice neutral middle ground. I consider doing a lot of different albums for this app, but Taylor Swift works. That's all I'm going to say on Taylor Swift. So here's we definitely are rendering the name of each album. We've got all 5 albums here, but we also have a warning that just popped up on the screen at the bottom. Something about each child should have a unique key prop. Check the render method, something, something, something. So let's take a quick break, continue the next section, and figure out exactly what this warning message is about.